This is an English headdress from the late Middle Ages, or at least my best approximation of it. Figuring out what this hat actually looked like was hard because of Protestant killjoys. Don't worry, I'll explain. I'll also share with you how I made this cool hat so that you too can dress like a 1480s English noblewoman, or just follow my journey along the way and soak up some cool historical facts. Hi everyone, welcome back. Today I'm making the headdress of a 1480s English noblewoman. Kinda specific, but I've become captivated by English funerary art from this period and the mystery around these images. The history of late 1400s England is often told. This was the period of the Wars of the Roses, the conflicts that would result in the reign of the Tudor dynasty. So nerds for royal history really love to talk about this period, but there are barely any contemporary images of the people in these stories. Just across the channel, there is a ton of art from this period. The Northern Renaissance was churning out absolutely iconic manuscripts and altarpieces that cemented the image of the Burgundian nobility into the canon of art history. In England, however, even though the culture and economy was intimately tied with Burgundy, there's just weirdly nothing, and there's a reason. England has seen a few waves of Protestant iconoclastic fervor, first with the rise of Protestantism and then again in the English Civil War. The iconoclasts believed it was sacrilegious to worship icons or religious images, and the majority of medieval art was religious, so the iconoclasts destroyed a lot of English medieval art. One notable exception to this is funerary art. Brass monuments embedded in the walls and floors of churches have largely survived, so have a lot of tomb effigies. These images are notable not only because they are some of the rare depictions of English people from this period, but also because they actually depict, uniquely English style. In Europe, there was a bit of a uniform for noblewomen in this period. A fur-lined V-neck gown, and of course the hennin. The women in English art wear this uniform too, but with a smaller hennin tipped to the back of their head, often with a veil protruding off the back of it, supported by wires. This headdress is ubiquitous in English funerary art, but pretty rare in other regions, so I feel comfortable saying it's an English style. It's often called the butterfly hennin, I guess because it has antennae that look like a proboscis, or because it has wings. I don't know. And this is also called a butterfly headdress sometimes, so call it all what you will. They are all words that we've come up with from the future. There are no period-written accounts of these headdresses, at least not that I know of, and no headdresses survive to this day, so to figure out how to make this thing, I just had to go off the images. And thankfully, there's a community of hobbyists in England who explore churches and catalog their finds, so there are a ton of pictures of these funerary monuments all over the internet, as well as in books that I can actually use the images from, because copyright stuff. This style is nearly always described in fashion history books as a truncated hennin or a flower pot hennin, but as I reviewed the images, one thing that became clear is that most of these figures are not actually wearing a cylindrical hennin at all. They seem to be wearing something that covers the sides of their head and maybe the back, but it is open at the top or has some sort of depression. It's definitely not a cylinder. And it also looks like the understructure for some padded roll styles. So I like the idea that this understructure though might be adapted and styled differently, and you could add your antenna arms to the back of it, or you could plop a roll of fabric on top depending on what you felt like wearing, or maybe these were really expensive things that were heirloom and passed down and you could update it if you don't like your mom's style and you want the cool antennas, but she did the padded roll thing, and Some headdresses in these funerary brasses do have more of a cylindrical look, just at the back of their head, more like a truncated hennin. And then there's this third type, which is sort of cylindrical but with a bit coming over the forehead. This type is in the brass monuments and other contemporary images of real people, but I actually found some more detailed images of something very similar donning allegorical figures in a manuscript, and in this historical painting. These images might give us clues to colors and materials that we can't read from the simpler funerary portraits, but they do need to be taken with a grain of salt. Medieval Europeans were obsessed with ancient Rome and with biblical figures, so a ton of medieval imagery depicts ancient subjects, but puts them in contemporary dress. It can be really hard to parse what is a fantastical style thrown in to antiquate the subject, and what is a thing that people actually wore in this period, because they're all kind of mixed up together. So all this to say, I think the English butterfly hennin is actually just a style of veiling worn with at least 3 distinct headpieces. The padded roll under thinger, the cylindrical hennin, and the super cylinder forehead guy. I'm gonna make the second one because it seems easiest. What seems most important to capture the English dead rich lady look is the antenna and the big veil, and definitely tipping it all to the back. So I think as long as I get that down, it's gonna look cool. The biggest challenge will be making this thing stay attached to the back of my head. I made a short video on this when I started this project. So here I'll just say this loop thing, this is important. It holds the hennin in place on your forehead, preventing it from sliding back. A velvet covered wire floats on my head and is held in place by a headband of stiffened canvas and velvet. There are little eyelet holes and leather cord at the back to keep the headband snug. The hennin will just sort of plug in on top of the headband, theoretically. I kind of made it out of velvet just cuz, but someone in the comments last time mentioned that velvet is actually a good choice because it's pretty Velcro-y. They mentioned that a lot of Jewish women who wear headscarves actually use a velvet headband underneath to keep everything in place. And I did end up discovering that the velvet is indeed quite key, so thank you for that tip. So no one knows what hennins were made of. Maybe wire, straw, stiffened vellum. I chose garbage. I had done a paper mock-up, so I knew the rough shape I was going for, and very roughly made that shape out of my garbage and a lot of hockey tape. It's a slightly tapered cylinder, but with some room cut out for the nape of my neck here. To make the outer fabric look adequately smooth over this abomination, it needed some padding between the fashion fabric and the plastic structure. I cut this out of this red wool, leaving just a bit of extra around the sides. While I was at it, I cut out a lining in a similar shape out of some scrap silk satin. I stitched the lining into place first. This was a total rookie move, and I should have put the lining in at the very end because, well, you'll see later. I pinned the wool in place and trimmed it to the exact size of the hat. Since the wool I'm using is a bit felted, I wasn't worried about the edges fraying at all. I butted the seam together instead of overlapping it so it would sit as flat as possible. I can't remember what exact stitches I used, but I think I stitched right through the edge of the wool here, taking care to not squish it too much. And along the top and bottom I did something like a whip stitch into the hockey tape. The hockey tape was pretty annoying to stitch through because of the adhesive, by the way, just for any of you watching at home who thought that maybe that was smart. It wasn't. I pinned my final layer in place, which was this dark blue upholstery velveteen. I tucked the edges under and did something like a slip stitch along the back seam and at the top and the bottom, taking care to get the lining and fashion fabric to close up neatly together and hide that wool padding. And then many months later, I got around to finishing this thing. Before adding any decoration, I steamed the whole thing to try to tighten the fabric and smooth out any wrinkles. Pearls are still pretty rare in this period in Western Europe. The huge strings of pearls that you see in old portraits are from the early modern period, when colonial projects and profits allowed a whole new level of conspicuous opulence in dress. But they're definitely around the shop enough to have a string of them somewhere quite noticeable. To attach the pearls, I anchored my thread to the hat, taking care to grab onto the wool layer, and I strung a bunch of them on, anchoring the string at even points around the hat. Then I went in and fixed the individual pearls in place by stitching the string down to the hat in between each pearl. For the rest of the bedazzling, I selected a few lumpy glass beads to spot around the thing. Cut stones were just beginning to be a thing in this period, and a hallmark of medieval jewelry is the irregular polished stones they used. To give my jewels a bit of extra brilliance, I grabbed some shiny paper and just slipped that behind each stone, just to reflect a bit of extra brilliance. These were all stitched in place with no particular art. To do this, I had to stitch right through the silk lining, and it all got real messy. If I put the lining in last, I could have hidden all that stitching. I did these sunburst patterns because I thought they would be cute, and it was a bit inspired by medieval halos. I think I got peanut butter on it. I'm not sure how convincingly medieval is. It's sort of taken on a bit of a, like, magician vibe. but I think with the veil on, it'll be alright. To the veil part. Hello, I'm a boomer and I'm filming my screen. So, one thing about these brass monuments is they always seem to have the antennas going off in different directions. We got these two are sort of like parallel. Like this one makes it look like there's 4 antennas, doesn't it? I think it does. Or it's just 2 straight up and then it's super starched. I don't know, man. I don't know. I picked up a 3-foot steel rod. If you're some sort of millionaire, you can also find brass rods pretty easily, which I think would look better, but they were like 15 bucks, so no way. I tried to cut this in half, but I brought teeny snips to a big snips job, so I eventually just got her done by bending it back and forth a few times. Quite a few times. My camera ran out of battery. I sanded the edges so that they wouldn't snag on anything, and I bent the rods into the shape I wanted by again bringing teeny tools to a big tools job and using them very unsafely and ineffectually. Eventually I ended up with a swirly top, an L-shaped bottom, and a minor injury. I made little casings for the L-shaped feet so I could stitch them into the hat. I fussed with the positioning of these for a really long time and eventually stitched them in place. At this point, I totally was forsaking any hope of neatness on the inside of the hat. Getting the folds of the veil right was important, so I mocked it up using a scale replica of my head. I found that a rectangular veil was the right option, and I made this out of a silk gauze, which is way cheaper than organza and I think just looks more accurate. The gauze was very limp and flowy though. I tried to remedy this by starching it heavily, which seems like it would be the period solution. I boiled some rice powder in water. I strained it, and then I diluted the starch in lukewarm water. I let my gauze soak in here for 10 minutes, stirring it around a bit, then strained it and hung it up to dry. Once it was dry, I ironed it flat. Not only was it very difficult to get it back in shape after it was wet, it also had white clumps of rice starch all throughout it. This was a bit of a disaster, and it took me 2 full hours of steaming it to get the lumps and wrinkles out, and it still doesn't look that great, and at this point it had lost a lot of its stiffness, so wouldn't really recommend this method. I ironed 1 fold down the center, flipped the veil, then ironed 2 folds radiating from the center front. This was to help hold the veil in the shape it needs to be, with those 2 peaks at the top. Then once I pinned it in place, it was done. It's a little lumpy and not strictly symmetrical, but I think I got the look, and honestly I love this thing. It's super fun to move around in. Again, the understructure is secured to my head, but the hennin itself is just held in place by friction, with the nap of the velvet doing a lot of the work. While this keeps everything in place pretty well, it is a bit uncomfortable. It also occasionally cuts off circulation to part of my forehead, resulting in this bulging purple vein situation, though it still needs some work to be actually wearable for a full day, but it's good enough for YouTube. In a few weeks, I'll be back with the final installment of this project where I make a dress that I'm pretty proud of now, but it was like kind of emotionally trying. Until then, watch my video on the history of hennin and have fun and make stuff, and I will see you in a few weeks. Bye!